In part one of the Algae Masterclass for Beginners, we talked about the purpose of algae and its role in an ecosystem. We covered a few common types of algae that occur in our tanks and ponds, and we walked through some steps to help determine the causes of an algae outbreak. Today in part two, we're going to go over some simple, inexpensive algae treatments that we can do in the short term to help us get it under control. And we'll go over some frequently asked questions about algae in aquariums and ponds. Now, in most cases, if you take the steps that I mentioned in part one with patience and consistency, then algae will remain at healthy levels. But there are times when there is a need for treatment, and in an otherwise healthy ecosystem, balance can be restored much easier than in an unhealthy system. Hydrogen peroxide is a good general purpose treatment that can kill many types of algae. It's not harmful to use occasionally, just not something you want to use all the time. First, remove as much of the algae as you can by hand and do about a 20% or so water change and turn off any filters. Now, in an aquarium, turn off the aquarium light and use 10 milliliters of peroxide per 10 gallons of water. In an outdoor pond, use anywhere from 10 milliliters up to 2 ounces of peroxide per 10 gallons of water. And be sure to apply the treatment in the evening. Now, the peroxide oxidizes and breaks down the cell walls of the algae. It can take a few days to see algae losing its color, and be sure to remove what you can of it as it dies. And a second application may be needed if no results are seen after 4 days or so. Now, as I said, this is not harmful if done occasionally, and it's safe for most plants. However, I have experienced Vallisneria melting back, some of it even dying from peroxide treatment. So if you have concerns about peroxide harming your plants, test it out first with some of the plant in a separate container to see how it responds. You can also do spot treatments with a syringe and apply the peroxide directly to the algae if it's not too widespread throughout your tank. After a peroxide treatment, another water change may be needed and vacuuming up the dead algae from the bottom of the tank or pond. Now, the dosing amount is not always an exact science, so I use the 10 milliliters per 10 gallon as a starting point, and if a second treatment is needed, I may try to increase the dosage. Now, some recommend using less than 10 milliliters of peroxide per 10 gallons of water, but this is just what has worked well for me over the years. Now, in part one, I forgot to talk about blue-green algae, and it has a specific treatment. Now, peroxide can work, but not as effective in my experience. Not really an algae, but a cyanobacteria, and it shows up in my tanks and ponds when there's an excessive buildup of organics, and it's usually in the heat of summer. And it has a very distinctive blue-green appearance and a very distinctive odor, almost like chemical-like odor. And enough of it can smother the plants and be harmful to fish. It's definitely a sign of imbalance, and the most effective way that I have found to treat it is to clean out the blue-green algae and debris with a vacuum and perform a partial water change, and then add Ultralife blue-green slime stain remover. It is not a harsh chemical. It's safe for fish, invertebrates, beneficial bacteria, and plants, and you don't have to do a heavy water change after the treatment like you do with other chemicals. It's not harming the ecosystem while it's killing the blue-green algae. Now, extreme outbreaks of cyanobacteria will need an antibiotic like erythromycin to kill it, which can potentially harm the beneficial bacteria as well, so it should definitely be a last resort. What about algae removal products or algaecides? Many of them can be a quick short-term fix, but they can potentially be harmful to some aquatic life. You definitely want to read the label before using them. Some of them will say do not use with shrimp or other crustaceans or snails, and they don't solve the underlying cause of the algae outbreak. I personally don't use these, and I haven't needed to thus far. If you decide to use an algaecide for a severe outbreak, just remember to read the label first, and remember it's a short-term fix. You'll still need to address the underlying problems of the algae outbreak. Should I do water changes to help control algae? Now there is a wide range of opinion about water changes. Some are adamant that an exact percentage should be replaced weekly or bi-weekly, and then at the other end of the spectrum, some people never do water changes. It really depends on how your tank is set up. If you have a heavily stocked tank, you will likely need to do regular water changes just to keep the nutrients in check. But if you have only a minimal number of stock and tons of plants and established beneficial bacteria, then you may not need weekly water changes. And testing the water on a regular basis is a good way to monitor this. I like to set up my tanks and ponds so that they don't need constant water changes, and that's a huge benefit of the ecosystem approach. But I do perform seasonal water changes every 3 to 4 months just as a general practice. Now, as a way to control algae, water changes can be helpful in the short term to reduce the excessive nutrients in the water. But if I have to do them every week, month after month, just to keep the algae from exploding, then something is off. And going back to the steps mentioned earlier to determine underlying causes of algae is a good idea. Now, floating plants like duckweed, frogbit, and salvinia are amazing at helping control algae because they grow quickly, using up those nutrients in the water, and they shade excess light. And they can help reduce constant water changes because they are using up those nutrients. Instead of changing the water to remove excess nutrients, you can just remove the excess plants as they proliferate. Once a week or so, I'll go through my tanks and ponds and thin out these floaters instead of doing weekly water changes. Do I need a bigger, better water filter to help control algae in my tank? Having adequate filtration can be helpful in controlling algae, but just like with water changes, the extent of your need for it depends on the conditions of your tank. With the ecosystem approach that I'm advocating, simple filtration is all you really need. I like to use hang-on-the-back filters, plenums, sponge filters, small water fountain pumps, and in some cases I don't even need a mechanical filter. Most of my small patio ponds don't have a filter. And this stock tank in my greenhouse, which has 3 large goldfish and who knows how many guppies, this other stock tank has 9 goldfish and also tons of guppies, none of which have a mechanical filter. But what they do have are tons of plants and a substantial amount of substrate in the bottom, also in marginal planters along the rim in which beneficial bacteria can live. And your substrate or potting media can also help with water filtration. One of the reasons that I like to use natural clay kitty litter or safety sorb as a primary substrate ingredient is because these can help filter the water. Now, all these products is a baked clay, bentonite or montmorillonite clay, which offers an excellent porous texture for beneficial bacteria to live on, and because it can store nutrients, if you will, through the process of cation exchange. And the nutrients are made available to the plants that are growing in the clay. And this works in both pond and aquarium applications. It can be used by itself or mixed with any other substrate, especially more expensive ones like aqua soil, and that helps manage the cost if you're setting up a large tank. Can't I just get algae eaters to solve my algae problem? I definitely utilize algae-eating fish, snails, and shrimp to help manage algae growth. However, if you have an algae outbreak already, they could simply add to the problem instead of help, because they produce waste just like any other tank inhabitant. And if the underlying cause of your outbreak is overstocking, then it's probably not going to help. Now, they can help manage algae growth as part of the ecosystem, but this has to be kept in balance with the other factors. They're not something you just throw in your tank for a quick fix thinking it's going to solve all your problems, but they are something that can help manage the algae if your tank is not overstocked. So what about seasonal container ponds? How can I establish an ecosystem if I've only got the pond set up for 3 or 4 months out of the year? During the winter, when I take down my seasonal ponds, my plants with the growing media, the substrate media, are growing in the greenhouse or indoors in aquariums, and so the beneficial bacteria populations or the biofilter remains established on them year round. So in the following spring, when I set up a new pond, I place those plants and media back in, and the whole system doesn't have to start from scratch like a brand new pond would. It just picks up where it left off. It's the same principle as seeding beneficial bacteria in a new aquarium by placing in media from an older established tank. Is there a reason to scrape algae off of the aquarium walls other than for aesthetics? This is strictly done for aesthetics. Now, what I do in most of my tanks, and it's a pretty common practice in the hobby, is to only scrape the front glass and leave the other sides alone, or scrape off the two most prominent sides of the aquarium and leave the other ones alone. This allows beneficial bacteria populations to build up, and it allows some algae to grow on it if it's in enough light. And this gives algae eaters more surface area to graze on, especially if they're keeping the tank clean of algae and they're doing a good job. This gives them more surface area to feed on. In fact, I don't even have to feed my autocinklus, snails, or shrimp anything specifically for them. They get it simply from foraging and scavenging. Why do I keep getting algae in my Java moss? Java moss is so finely textured that the smallest bits of debris can get trapped in it, and this creates an ideal spot for various algae to grow. It's a common problem for many aquarists, and it's why I personally only keep it in a few tanks. Mechanical filtration, like a hob filter, can help and make sure there's good current flowing throughout the tank. Now, once a week or so, pour water or stir up the water around the Java moss to kick up the debris that has landed on it so it can be carried away by the current. Shrimp and snails can be a big help as they scavenge through the moss and keep it clean, and make sure that the light is not too bright or on for too long. Java moss does not need much light to thrive, and it can easily outcompete algae in shadier conditions. Now, the same problem can happen with Marimo mossballs, which is actually not a moss but a species of filamentous algae, oddly enough. But it grows in a controlled form instead of growing everywhere like the less desirable kinds of algae. But the moss balls can still trap debris and be a host for various species of algae, and before long you realize there's a layer of algae all over them. But the solutions are the same as Java moss. Filtration, dust them off periodically, shrimp and snails, mind the light. Well, hopefully this masterclass has given you a basic understanding of algae, its role in the ecosystem, and how it can even be helpful, and given you some practical steps on managing it in your aquarium or pond. And I'll finish with this question. Has this masterclass changed the way that you think about algae and given you confidence in managing it going forward? It's always my goal that these videos are helpful for you, and I would love to hear from your experience. Well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.